I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, booming, busted, or simply balanced. Minnesota Management and Budget shares Minnesota's economic forecast.
State leaders are going to face hard decisions.
Plus, the latest efforts to end gun violence.
We shouldn't have to wait for just one more shooting death to take action. The time for action is right now.
And when it comes to advancing technology, data centers play a central role.
They are necessary, but the question becomes, where do they need to be?
The push to keep them out of neighborhoods. That's all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
Senators, students, and gun violence prevention supporters sang and rallied in the Capitol Rotunda to advocate for new gun violence prevention laws. Here comes the sun, it's all right. Annunciation Catholic Church families say they're holding legislators in hope for a future free from gun violence. As part of the group's Day of Action, students' desks were brought to the Capitol to highlight the number of young lives lost to gun violence since 2021. This is not the first time these families have come to the Capitol. Over the interim, many testified before the Senate's Gun Violence Prevention Working Group. Senator Ron Latz led those meetings and joins us now with the latest on the Senate's gun violence prevention efforts. Senator, it's great to see you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there have been several high-profile instances of gun violence recently, prompting a conversation with urgency and earnest around gun violence prevention. That conversation really started during the interim. So what happened during that time? Take me through our work during the interim.
Sure. Well, we had the shootings of the Hortmans and the Hoffmans in June, and then we had the Annunciation shooting, and gun violence has been an issue for a long time, but these really brought it to the forefront for us. And we figured it was time to pull a little broader group together to try to figure out what we can do. So Senator Zainab Mohammed and I put together this gun violence prevention working group just to try to get more ideas on the table, have some hearings, take input from the public and the experts, try to build some bipartisanship in approaching these issues. And we vetted an awful lot of suggestions, some of which now we're seeing coming up at the legislature in proposals. The working group itself was not intended to be a long-term ongoing operation. It was intended just to kind of bring the issues up, work on them, demonstrate that we are thinking about how to handle this, and then set the platform for us this session.
I know there was some resistance during the interim with your Republican colleagues saying they wanted to do the work during this session. We're here now, we're in session, so what can we expect to see coming out of the Senate during the session in regard to gun violence prevention?
Well, there are really two questions in there. One is, what can we expect to see from the Republicans who wanted to do the work during session? The funny thing is there's a lot of stuff that gets pre-drafted before the session, especially with a short session. You can't just come up with ideas and come up with solutions during session, get it drafted, processed, and through the legislature. So most of the work happens in the interim, with meeting with stakeholders, with experts, with Senate counsel or revisers to come up with the right drafting for it. But we do have quite a few ideas. The governor's office has put together a package of proposals. One thing that was frustrating for me was, even during that working group meetings, is, within 15 minutes of deciding we were going to put together a package, I could sit down and wrote out a whole list of things that I'd like to see that would help us move in the direction of reducing gun violence. And then my GOP colleagues came to the hearing and said, basically, it's too soon, we haven't had time to think about this. We're way too late, frankly, in thinking about these things. Or I shouldn't say we, they should be at the table with us. So we're going to have packages this legislative session. We'll pass something, I hope.
Well, speaking of the things that you'd like to see, you have a lot of expertise in this area, being, chair of your committee and hearing this, year after year. So in your opinion, what is the number one thing the legislation can do this session to prevent gun violence?
I think it's going to be hard to pick one. Because there, as the saying goes, there is no silver bullet here. And there's no way to avoid gun metaphors in our conversations in American English language, just that's the way it is. But it's an apt metaphor here. If there were one thing that we knew we could do that would solve the problem, it would have been done a long time ago, and we wouldn't have a gun violence problem anymore. So we've got to come at it from a whole bunch of different angles. You know, we passed the red flag law, which we know is working to save lives. We passed the universal background check law, which we know will help screen out people who shouldn't be having firearms from getting them, or getting them as easily anyway. But there are other things that we can do too. Assault weapons ban, high capacity magazine limits, which I think would go a long way, frankly, you know, for at least interrupting mass shootings, because if you can only shoot 10 rounds instead of 100 rounds before you have to stop, change magazines, reload, that's an interruption point where bystanders can jump in and maybe stop the shooting altogether. We can do more to safely store and secure firearms to avoid them being accessible to being stolen by people who want to do nefarious things, or being accessed by children who will play with them and cause damage that way. We have to do the ghost gun and the binary trigger bans. All of these are little pieces. We can do more investment in counseling in the schools to identify and assist the children that are starting to show signs of distress or anxiety that might lead them down a path toward violence. And if there are firearms accessible to them, firearms involving violence. There's a lot of things that we can do. What we can pass, you know, what could become bipartisan, that's what we're going to try to work on this session.
Well, you mentioned counseling in schools, and that kind of falls under the common sense solutions that your colleagues across the aisle are calling for. So how does that fit into the conversation? It sounds like there might be some bipartisan wiggle room there, right?
Yeah, I would think there would be. You know, there's a budget that goes with a bunch of these things too, so there's always a function of what do we have fiscally to work with. But I think you probably could find bipartisan consensus that we need to have enough adults in the schools who are experienced and can identify the children that are under stress and might be moving in this direction. And that's, you know, that's important. I don't think we can lay it all on mental health issues either. 99% of people with mental health issues are not violent, right? There are some. People that tend to get this violent probably do have some mental health concerns, or at least they're going through a short-term crisis, if not a long-term condition. But that's one important piece. Maybe we can find common ground on that. But that's not all we need. I mean, some of the kids that are, you know, the shooter from Annunciation had been a student there, but had been gone for several years and was still engaged in a crisis situation that brought him back to the school. So you can try to get the kids identified in elementary school or middle school or in high school, but you've got to have a more wraparound social services network, destigmatize getting mental health care, and those kind of things. That's an important part of it. But as I say, if they've got access to the firearms, they're more likely to use firearms when they get aggressive. If it's harder for them to get firearms, then they're likely to act out in other ways. So how do we reduce gun violence? Part of it is keeping firearms out of the hands of people that would use them in a bad way.
That does bring me to my next question, is that there can be concerns when we talk about gun violence prevention, we actually can turn that conversation into gun control. So what do you say to the people who have that concern that, you know, we'd be moving into territory that they're uncomfortable with?
I don't like to use the term gun control. It's a loaded term now, and it gives the impression that we want to control every firearm in the possession of everyone. The Second Amendment prohibits that. Whether we agree or disagree with the Second Amendment's interpretation by the U.S. Supreme Court, that's the law of the land. And nothing that we are proposing to do, in my judgment, would infringe on that Second Amendment, which is to say a person who could lawfully carry and possess a firearm has a right to do so. Now, every constitutional amendment, every part of the Bill of Rights is subject to some regulation. Even Justice Scalia, who wrote the decision that expanded the Second Amendment to the rights of private individuals to possess firearms beyond militia, even said it's not unlimited. Regulation is appropriate. And then the question is, where are those regulatory lines drawn? So the Second Amendment can comfortably coexist with a regulatory structure that helps to prevent firearms from getting into the hands of people who shouldn't have them. People that have violent criminal histories, people that have a history of drug use, people that have that are felons that prohibits them under statute, people with a history of domestic violence. These are all people that have a history of acting out violently, and if they're going to do so, we don't want them using firearms because that's the most lethal form of acting out violently. Federal law constrains us on this as well, so we have to act within the federal constraints. But when you're talking about assault weapons ban, for example, even the Supreme Court's interpretation, which tells us to go back to what the original founders were looking at and what was the state of the law at the time our country was founded, there weren't automatic weapons back in 1776, right? So I don't see any reason why assault weapons couldn't be constitutionally banned. Limitations on magazines seems to me to be a reasonable regulation, whether it's a military-style assault weapon or whether it's a handgun that can have large capacity magazines as well. You got to be able to figure out who is prohibited, hence we have the background checks. There are things we can do without getting anywhere near the Second Amendment, like the red flag law. Now, they raise some issues because the opponents try to tie this into the Second Amendment, and then they raise the hackles about everything is the government trying to get their nose under the tent. Next stop, they're going to be in your closets taking away your firearms. That's not where I'm going with it. I don't think most of us feel like we want to go that far with things because we have to live with the Second Amendment too. So there's plenty of room here constitutionally to protect the public and reduce gun violence and protect the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment.
Senator, you've brought up a lot of ideas. Your caucus has ideas. The Republican caucus has ideas. Even Governor Walz has his own package. But given that there's a one-seat majority in the Senate, a tie in the House, and a short session, like you mentioned, what is the likeliness that gun violence prevention measures will pass this session?
Well, that's the big question, right? And this is not a purely partisan question. We have some members of the Senate DFL caucus, and I would assume the House DFL caucus, that are not comfortable with certain kinds of actions, these proposals that we're thinking about. And there are some members of the Republican caucuses on both sides, I know within the Senate side, that are open to these conversations and that represent districts that would overwhelmingly support some of these measures. So I think we have to, look, I worked with some of the more conservative members in my caucus when we passed the red flag law and the background check law. And we made adjustments to the language there to meet their concerns and to address some of what was important to them about it. I'm willing to do the same with the GOP members of the Senate because I think it's important that we make progress on this. I would hope that they'll come to the table if they are going to represent their residents that they represent in the Senate, certainly in the purple districts, if you will, the districts that are closely divided politically. I'm talking about suburban districts largely. If they want to vote with their district, they're going to find a way to work with me and with Senator Muhammad to come up with packages that will pass.
If a package doesn't pass this session, what's next? Where does that leave us?
Well, we come back another session, but I also think it means that we have an obligation to make sure in the coming election that the voters understand what position their legislators are taking on this issue. There are lots of other issues that voters use to decide, what's important to them. We know in a lot of districts the Second Amendment is important to voters, and they sometimes make that a single issue. They're going to vote for or against a person based on whether or not they're going to protect the right to bear arms. I think we need the flip side of that too. We need the issue to be highlighted enough, top of mind for voters in these other more purple or divided districts politically, that says we're not going to vote for you unless you support reasonable measures to reduce access to firearms and to limit some of the characteristics of firearms that are most destructive. If people start voting on that issue, and more importantly, if legislators start thinking that their voters are going to vote on that issue, we're going to find some common ground.
Senator, as a final thought, families from the Annunciation Church, we're here advocating for change. What do you want them to hear and all the other Minnesotans, impacted by gun violence?
I want them to hear, and I want all Minnesotans to hear, that we're here working on this issue, that we intend to make progress, that we're going to hold our legislators accountable for the positions that they take on these issues. And if they don't support reasonable measures to reduce gun violence, we're going to try to replace them with other legislators that will support these measures. That's the bottom line. You got to have the votes to pass things. Those all sorts of other issues over the years have been turning points like that. I don't want to have to come back another legislative session and say, well, we missed a turning point here and we're just waiting for the next, crime of mass violence to occur. And I would also note, this isn't only about the mass shootings, right? Every day in America, in ones and twos, people are dying from gun violence. The largest cause of firearm death in Minnesota is suicide, not homicide. And that's primarily a greater Minnesota problem, disproportionately anyway. So access to firearms by people undergoing crisis, access to firearms that are not safely secured, access to firearms by kids who are playing with it, see it on TV, see it on social media, see it on cartoons. Access to firearms by people who shouldn't have them is a real crisis. Now, we shouldn't have to wait for just one more shooting death to take action. The time for action is right now.
Senator, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Senators' work to balance the budget last session is now paying dividends. Minnesota Management and Budget's February forecast finds the state's projected deficit has been replaced with a surplus. And while that's something to celebrate, challenges remain. A looming deficit to a projected surplus in just a few months.
We now project to end fiscal years 26-27 with a surplus of $3.7 billion, which is $1.3 billion more than forecast in November. As a result, we're currently forecasting a $377 million positive balance in FY 28 and 29. The increased projected balance in both biennia is due to a slightly improved national economic outlook, which drives an increase in forecast revenues. Minnesota is in a strong financial position.
Minnesota Management and Budget says the state's budget and economic forecast is strong, but not exactly secure, with the federal government saying it will freeze funds until Minnesota fixes its fraud.
On January 6th, CMS indicated their intent to withhold $515 million per quarter from the state's MA reimbursement. That action is currently pending appeal, and the loss of federal funds is not reflected in our estimates today. We received additional notice from CMS that they would defer $260 million of our Medicaid reimbursements pending further information from the state to justify claims that they flagged. Federal funds are a very important piece of the state budget. Federal funds make up about $1 in every $3 spent by state agencies.
As we balance this budget, we're going to have to think about what kind of flexibility is going to be necessary for the administration if those cuts come.
Even without factoring in the uncertainty around federal funding, Minnesota legislators still have to face and fix the state's current spending patterns.
In total, we project that spending in the current biennium will be $68 million lower than our previous estimates, but the planning estimates have increased by $152 million since our last forecast.
Despite tremendous progress in the last legislative session, more work is needed to address the ongoing structural imbalance to align revenues and spending. The sooner we begin looking for additional ways to do that, the less likely we are to face a future fiscal cliff.
And not all of the February forecast's figures are favorable. Minnesotans are feeling financial strain.
We are observing some signs of consumer stress with higher delinquency rates in certain loans. Credit cards, auto loans, and student loans. Minnesota's unemployment rate has continued to increase over the past year.
Minnesotans are facing hard decisions because their costs are rising, but their wages are flat. And state leaders are going to face hard decisions.
We got to make sure that we are focusing on the needs of Minnesotans for affordability. That means tax conformity. That means making sure that we're lowering things such as tab fees for vehicles. That means that we're focusing on things that affect things like property taxes.
So while they may disagree on how we got here and how to solve the problem, legislators are committing to moving forward together.
We got to work together and making sure that we are focusing on Minnesotans and trimming down government spending in a way that helps out this state to make sure they can grow and prosper in ways that we haven't seen for a long time.
Last year, we made hard compromises to balance the budget. We did it together. Hard choices resulted in the forecast that we are experiencing today. And I really do hope that we find that spirit again.
To address affordability concerns within the state, Senate Republicans rolled out a legislative package they say provides tax relief for Minnesotans. The bills focus on property taxes, license tab fees, and ending taxes on tips and overtime for workers.
This is a raise for our workers that doesn't cost our small businesses a single cent. We aren't asking for a handout, we're asking for the state to stop penalizing the extra effort. No more taxing our tips and no more taxing our overtime.
The senators say these changes will encourage economic growth across the state. Another strategy for improving Minnesota's financial outlook is to raise revenue. Senator Aaron Mayquade says some of that work began last session when certain data center tax exemptions were eliminated. Now, the companies behind those qualified large-scale data centers will contribute more tax revenue to the state. But that doesn't mean their presence is entirely welcome everywhere. Senator Bill Lieske says there is a place for data centers in Minnesota, but that place just isn't in our neighborhoods. Senator, welcome back to Senate Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm very excited to talk to you today about the topic of data centers. It seems like they've been in the news more and more lately. We're hearing there are conversations in Eagan about a one-year moratorium on incorporating them. There are conversations in Hermantown and Farmington. So let's start at the beginning. What are data centers?
Okay, so that's the toughest question, right? It's actually defining what it is. Originally, when we were growing up, it was a small group of servers in a small back room and in a tiny little area. So it didn't take up much space and nobody really thought anything of it. So it was a tiny little commercial building. Now we're talking about industrial sized buildings, massive footprints, and so those store huge amounts of servers. And what do? It used to be storing data like patients and telephone numbers and things like that. And now it actually helps operate AI programs and things like that. So it's much bigger and much broader.
And what is the concern with having these data centers nearby in communities?
So like I was saying, originally data centers, they were small, little tiny commercial buildings, nothing really to think of. You'd drive by it and think it was an office building. Now today, if you drive by the one just inside my district on the north end, in Rosemount, it's a huge data center, right? It looks like an industrial complex, and that's what they are. So having an industrial complex, you know, a couple hundred feet from your house, probably a lot different than having an office building a couple hundred feet from your house.
Yeah, it's not the neighbor you're looking for. No. And I have to imagine it could have some impact on property value and utility bills, right? So those are the concerns with data centers in neighborhoods. Are there any benefits to having them, or is there an argument for it?
Yeah, so a data center is still necessary, right? In today's world, we are trying to advance technology. Well, without a data center, we can't do that. So they are necessary, but the question becomes, where do they need to be? Again, this would segue into what I've been working on, and that's finding a way to have them be where they belong, industrial complexes away from residential areas.
And to that point, last session you introduced Senate File 607 regarding the placement of data centers. Tell me more about that bill and where it landed.
So the bill originally had a hearing coming in State Gov. Unfortunately, it got canceled. That's the part that I was really disappointed about. The bill was designed to try and thread the needle, as I like to say, in politics. It's a word we hear all too often. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a happy middle ground. What people in Minnesota need, which is data centers, but where they should go. And so By definition, I look at a data center of what they're trying to build today as an industrial complex, and so they should be industrial zones, and that's what this bill does. It also allowed for an inspection to make sure that the water sources and the electricity sources are there and available for the project that they're trying to build.
Any plans on introducing it again this session?
So yeah, it's still an active bill. I'm hoping that we can get a hearing maybe again this year and actually get through the hearing as opposed to having it canceled. And so looking forward to getting a good discussion going. Data centers has definitely changed, and I don't think anybody knew how it was going to change. And I always say government's slow. So we're catching up to what we should probably be talking about and probably should have been talking about 10 years ago.
Given the response from communities that we're seeing, do you think more legislation regarding data centers will be introduced this session?
I have a feeling the discussion of data centers isn't going anywhere. It's only going to get more busy, and it's going to get more in depth because people are still learning what they are. Like you said, some people just assume they're just the little office buildings still.
And I know this is speculative, but do you expect there to be any better traction for the legislation this session?
Yeah, you're asking a very difficult question. This legislature is a very challenging one with only one seat difference in the majority of either body. It makes things interesting. And it's also a bipartisan issue. It spans across both parties, which is good, but it's also bipartisanly opposed. So that's the hard part.
Regarding the conversation around data centers, I'm also seeing NDAs come up, or non-disclosure agreements. How do these two topics relate?
So for the example of Farmington, that's the area that I represent, and so that's why I got involved in data center discussion. The number one thing is local municipalities were being asked to sign NDAs before they could even discuss what the project was. Well now, because of those NDAs, they didn't get to tell their constituents what was happening until after the project was already full steam ahead and possibly, past the point where they could stop it. And so that's where I have an issue. Your constituents have a right to know what you're doing, and we shouldn't be signing NDAs for those things.
And you've said you support efforts to ban NDAs, and you cited a House initiative to do that. I know that there are two DFL senators who also have similar ideas out there, Senators Grant Hochschild and Jen McEwen. Talk to me about the push for this to ban NDAs or at least limit them.
Yeah, so NDAs are a challenging subject. Obviously, there are times where I think NDAs might be necessary. I'm going to say the word might because I'm not 100% sold yet. Actually, I can give one example where I think they might be necessary, and that would be if I'm taking a tour of a facility. Again, I'm touring. They're already owned. They're already controlled property. I don't need to tell the trade secrets, right? I've been on tours where I have to sign an NDA just saying I won't tell the public about what I saw. Great, that makes sense. But the NDAs that don't make sense are when you're buying property, when you're trying to have cities rezone things for your property. No, that's pretty sketchy, and that seems pretty behind the scenes, and you're trying to control the situation.
Okay, Senator, any final thoughts on data centers or NDAs?
Well, as I've been saying since the beginning, data centers are necessary. It's just we need to be wise and thoughtful about how we're going to create them and where we're going to put them.
Senator, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been enlightening.
Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.